evening in the Deloitte offices with this backdrop of a rather grey and grisly Auckland, so kudos to you all for venturing out in the rain. So just quickly, a little bit about me and why I'm up here. So I joined Deloitte just shy of 18 months ago to pursue work specifically in the ESG space. Prior to that, I worked at Rutherford Reed as a financial advisor, and then ANZ Private Bank, and then spent some time as an equities trader at Macquarie. So it's really great for me to be able to continue working in the finance space at Deloitte, in particular supporting Mindful Money, Centre for Sustainable Finance, and in particular the Aotearoa New Zealand Investor Coalition for Net Zero. Deloitte, like many organisations, has a pretty large role to play in the journey to net zero. For us, advising professional clients across the board, from private to public, investors to corporates, all around the world, the challenges our clients are facing are pretty big, because the world's changing. Decarbonisation and addressing climate change in general is one of the biggest issues in the world right now. Many businesses, particularly the finance sector as well, they recognise this change, and they say they want to contribute to a positive, low-carbon future. They say they do. Certainly, interest levels are increasing, and I think looking out at you all today, and hello to those online, is a testament to the importance of this topic and to the importance of this event. So what is the purpose of this event? Well, it is to tell you all the results of a survey that the Coalition has released today on the state of net zero progress in New Zealand. So Barry will give you some insights to the Coalition after me, and then we'll hear those results as well from David Lewis. We've got a jam-packed agenda tonight, so it will be a little bit of a challenge to get through it all. We've got some fantastic speakers coming to us live on Zoom, some pre-recorded messages, and then some fantastic panellists and presenters in person as well. As a responsible MC, I should tell you two things. So bathrooms are just behind you down the hall there onto the left. And if there's a fire, just follow my instructions, but we will head down to the stairs, which are on the right of the hall as well. Before I hand over to Barry, I'd just like to open today's gathering with a karakia. The purpose of this karakia is to guide this gathering to be one of clear reflection, and so that we're outcome focused as well. Tū taua mai I ronga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I wahu. Kia tau ai te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumie, huie, taike. I'll now hand over to Barry to give us some more information on the Coalition and sort of intro today's session. Barry Coates, most of you in this room will know him. He is the CEO and founder of Mindful Money, a social enterprise that aims to make investment a force for good. Mindful Money provides transparency on holdings in KiwiSaver and investment funds, educates the public through seminars like this one today, holds annual awards for the best ethical and impact investment funds, and undertakes advocacy on climate change and sustainability. Thanks, Barry.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Amy, and thanks to Amy and Deloitte for hosting us tonight. Great to see you all, and thank you very much for coming on a wet evening. I am sort of, in a way, introducing a little bit of who's doing this and why. I'm up here representing the Aotearoa New Zealand Coalition for Investor Net Zero. Say it's an impossible kind of, there's no acronym that we could ever find and a very clumsy title, but anyway. We came up with this a year ago as a way to respond to what was happening at the time. So this was the time of COP26 a year ago in Glasgow, with a huge amount of international activity on pledges for net zero. And frankly, a deafening silence in New Zealand. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to explore with the finance sector to say, is there an appetite in order to make net zero pledges or to enter along a pathway towards net zero? And is there a way that we as a coalition can help that to happen and be supportive, raise public awareness, etc.? And so that's where we started. A year ago, we did a smaller survey than this one and launched it at a seminar. And over the past year, you'll find out a little bit more about what we're doing, but we've continued with awareness raising. We've continued with a community of practice, which is chaired by Amy, as you'll hear more of. So really, you know, the aims have stayed pretty much the same, which is to encourage the investment world to use their position, their role as either asset owners, wealth managers, or fund managers in order to play a part in the climate transition. Because I guess all of us in this room know that investors have a powerful voice and a powerful role to play in moving not only New Zealand towards net zero, but to play a role in doing so internationally. So the three core members have collaborated on this survey. So that's Mindful Money, Toitu Tahua, the Centre for Sustainable Finance, led by Joe Kelly over here, and the Investor Group on Climate Change, and you'll be hearing from Harrison Smith in a little while, coming to us on Zoom. The survey has benefited hugely from the hard work that David Lewis, who we'll hear from in a minute, has put into it, so we should really strongly acknowledge the great work that he's put into the survey and the preparation of the report. So the wider coalition includes some supporting organisations, Sustainable Business Council, Sustainable Business Network, the Financial Services Council, Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, and Toitu EnviroCare. So their support has been terrific, and so we have now got to the stage of having an executive summary to put down. That we should have a copy, because it's actually weighty enough to go beyond what an executive summary usually is to put it down on the table, but we haven't got one. We are going to, in this seminar, hear from 2 video recordings, the first of which literally came in yesterday, and it was from Mark Carney. So we had asked Mark Carney to contribute a video some time ago, and we weren't sure that it was coming, and we were thrilled when it did, because he has played an amazing role in this work. Initially, of course, in his advocacy as Governor of the Bank of England, then Governor of the Bank of Canada, essentially one of the founders of TCFD, together with Michael Bloomberg, and then subsequently in the Glasgow Alliance on net zero, GFANZ. So without further ado, let's hear the video from Mark Carney.
It's a great pleasure to join you on behalf of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And I'd like to begin by applauding Deloitte for organizing this Net Zero Summit. And I'd also like to congratulate IGCC, Mindful Money, and Toitu Tahua for helping us assess the state of sustainable finance in New Zealand, and as a consequence, to drive forward climate progress. So we're approaching, as I record this, the last day of COP27. And I'd just like to make a few reflections on the current state of net zero in the financial sector. Unlocking the full potential of private finance in the fight against climate change requires ambition, action, and accountability. Ambition. Through GFANZ, over 550 of the world's largest and leading financial institutions have committed to reduce their financed emissions in line with 1.5 degrees, including 7 leading institutions based in New Zealand. And with the launch of our regional network in Africa and, most importantly, in Asia Pacific, we're building a global coalition that spans over 50 countries. course, the purpose of that coalition is not just to set targets, but it's to take action. And in order to operationalize these commitments, GFANZ has developed a comprehensive framework for net zero transition plans of both financial institutions and companies. Transition means financing climate solutions and the growth of companies that are already aligned with net zero. But it means much more. It also means going to where the emissions are and backing those companies, it could be countries as well, but those companies with credible transition plans to get those emissions down. And since the world can't divest to net zero, a just transition requires financial institutions to support the managed phase-out of stranded assets. Action also means developing strategies to set and achieve near-term science-based targets. And to that end, GFANZ members have already set over 300 near-term targets, almost twice the number that were due by COP. At the start of last year, not a single bank had a science-based 2030 target. Those net zero transition plans are strategic plans, and they affect, as a consequence, every aspect of a company's operations, from its governance and compensation to its objectives, its implementation strategy, its engagement strategy, and the metrics it uses to track progress. The other way to track progress is through an accountability mechanism, and all of GFANZ's work will now be held to account by a new net zero data public utility. By this time next year, the data utility will provide consistent, accurate, and openly available climate transition-related data to allow all stakeholders, financial institutions, regulators, civil society, and the general public to track climate progress. Stakeholders will be able to determine whether gaps between a financial institution's targets and its performance are due to the financial institution itself or the product of broader factors such as inadequate country climate policies or poor enabling environment. And this brings me to a critical point. Finance cannot drive the net zero transition on its own. Finance is an enabler, a catalyst that can speed what governments, companies, and entrepreneurs initiate. And based on real-world experience, GFANZ members are calling on governments to do more, including sectoral transition plans, including making mandatory this approach to financial institution planning, and also to pricing the externalities of carbon and ensuring that carbon credit markets play a meaningful role going forward. To sum up, through ambition, action, and accountability from financial institutions and governments, we can achieve our climate goals. I'd like to salute all of you for your efforts and encourage you to encourage others to join our drive for progress so we can all get to net zero by the mid-century. Thank you very much.
So that was great to have that from Mark Carney, and I think it sets us off well in the seminar. We're going to use a little device to keep you all awake, Slido. Everyone kind of does this with your phones, yeah. So get your phone out. Focus on the QR code, and please, when you get there, go to the poll. So you see on the left the Q&A section that you can use for Q&A. And on the right is the polls, and there should be the first poll loaded up. Everyone see it? Yeah? Nodding around the room. Need another couple of seconds? Okay, here we go. So the 8 last year included 4 from Crown financial institutions. And so now a year later, when of course there's kind of much more time has passed, how are we doing? Okay, it looks like we're fairly stable on this. So the answer is, drum roll please, 11. So it's not much more than 8. So congratulations to Kiwi Wealth, IAG and BNZ, who have signed up to targets in that time. We know that others are on the pathway to doing so, and that's evidenced in the report, and we can look forward to further progress. I think that's a slightly sobering view of how far we've moved. I'm going to pass back to Amy to take us through to the next video.
Thanks, Barry. So we'll come back to the Slido again later on in this seminar, and then we'll also use the Slido to pose questions to the panellists once we have the panel. So our next video recording message to us is from another pretty famous climate advocate that we all know, Dr. Rod Carr. So Dr. Carr, as I said, known to many, and most famously in Aotearoa for being the chairperson of the Climate Change Commission. Dr. Carr has extensive experience in both public and private sector governance and leadership. He served as chair and non-executive director of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and served as deputy governor and for a time acting governor of the bank. And some may have seen him recently at COP as part of the high-level expert group on net zero founded by the UN earlier this year, and you would have seen the pretty rousing speech by the UN Secretary General on this. So Dr. Carr will no doubt speak to this in his video, but essentially the net zero group came forward with a report highlighting 5 principles and 10 commitments on how to essentially have integrity in commitments and actually move action forward. So we'll hear from Rod now.
Ina mana, ina iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rod Carr aho. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I think of talking to you as finance peers, given my background in money and banking. But let me tell you the honest truth. Global capital is on the move. And recent work that I've been doing to provide advice, along with 16 other colleagues, on greenwashing suggests that claims of net zero are not all they should be, or all that some of those who make these pledges would like them to be. A high-level expert group provided advice to the Secretary-General of the United Nations that was released at COP27 on guidance to improve the credibility of net zero claims by non-state actors. That means everybody who makes those claims who is not a nation state. That means cities and regions. It means businesses and banks. It means fund managers and others who have or would like to make pledges to get on board with net zero. About a third of the largest 200 publicly listed companies in the world today have at least attempted to make a net zero pledge. But less than half of those have even got a plan. So how credible is that pledge? The advice that was provided to the Secretary-General outlines 5 principles and 10 recommendations about how to improve the credibility and integrity of net zero pledges for the benefit of those who genuinely, in making those claims, seek to differentiate themselves, to provide greater benefits to their investors, to provide cheaper capital to their borrowers, and to provide reassurance that when a claim is made, it has the integrity of other comparable claims. It's very clear that a net zero pledge has to be a lot more than a try hard, hope and pray promise. A net zero pledge, to be credible, needs to be made publicly by the most senior leaders and governors of the institution making the pledge. The pledge should only be made by entities that covers all of their emissions, including Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, which for financial institutions includes their financed emissions. To be credible, a pledge needs to have intermediate milestones that are measurable and independently verifiable and have a frequency or cadence consistent with the likely longevity of those who are making them. So a pledge needs to have a milestone at 2025, 2030, and 2035. It needs to cover all gases and identify those gases separately. And it needs to focus on gross emissions reductions, not offsets. If nation states were to adopt these principles and the recommendations, then a net zero pledge would truly be binding and truly make a difference to our global warming pathway. Fewer organisations might choose to make these pledges, but those who make them would know that they were among good company. It's pretty clear to me that the planet is not on a trajectory to hold global temperature warming below 2 degrees this century. And indeed, much of the evidence says we'll be knocking on 2.8 to 3 degrees warmer by the latter parts of this century. Global capital is on the move because in that kind of environment, the promises to draw on future production look much less valuable than they might otherwise be. But there are opportunities. There is absolutely no doubt now that the transition, whether it is a smooth, continuous and well-planned one or an abrupt and disruptive one, will occur. It will occur this century because the global emissions that we are currently making are utterly unsustainable and incompatible with the society that we have created. The unsustainable will not be sustained. Global capital is beginning to hunt for the low emission sources of prosperity to fund them ahead of, not behind the curve. It's very clear that from New Zealand's point of view, lowering our emissions is not about an obligation to others. It's about setting ourselves up for a thriving and prosperous society in a low emissions future, even if the world is a warmer place. There is no doubt that when capital is deployed in New Zealand to lower the emissions that we commit to because of the way we live, how we get around, and how we earn our incomes, that those lower emission lifestyles will be relatively more affordable than high emitting lifestyles in the future. That is already becoming self-evident. But more importantly, livelihoods based on high emitting products and services are going to be more vulnerable to disruption, and the assets deployed to support those livelihoods are going to be more vulnerable to becoming stranded. As banks look to account for their financed emissions and cap those emissions and reduce them over time, then not only will credit be allocated to borrowers, but emissions will be allocated to borrowers. And banks, in allocating credit caps and emission caps, will consider the prospects of those businesses going forward. That in the insurance industry, not only will cover for climate-related events become more expensive, it may, in some cases, become unavailable. And the nexus between an inability to seek insurance cover and a banker's reluctance to be the residual risk holder will mean that the cost of insurance and cost of capital will rise for those businesses and households exposed to high-emitting activities. And that's why I've become convinced that the transition to a low-emitting society by the middle of this century is actually in New Zealand's interests, irrespective of the fact that our emissions won't change the world, irrespective of any argument that we could be a role model for others. The fact is, even in a warmer world, our low-emitting society and ways of living and earning a living will be more sustainable, less vulnerable to disruption, and endow our children and grandchildren with more options and opportunities than our current high-emitting pathway. Not only will global capital hunt out those opportunities. Local capital will too. But to date, if we look at the survey results, it is far from clear that local capital in New Zealand has got the memo. We are playing tokenism. We are slow to join the crowd. We are not a world leader. We are in danger of believing our own stories. We need to get with the plan. We need to be ahead of the great tide of history for our own self-interest. The survey provides insights, truths, and evidence about what is actually going on or not going on. I commend it to you, but mainly I encourage you to join the great tide of history. We will reduce emissions. Societies that do it sooner will be better off. Societies that are laggards will pay higher prices, higher cost of capital, and absorb greater risks in our lifetime. This is not just about the unborn generations to come. This is about your decisions, your spheres of influence, the part you must play so you can tell your children what you did to make their world a better place. Kia ora. E mana e iwi.
Winner there, and I think leading this question after Dr. Carr's message has probably influenced the outcome. I don't think Barry and I were expecting this strong result, so we can tell Dr. Carr that his speech worked. So the answer is actually 50 to 75%. 50 to 70%, and in particular, or specifically 58%. I think we've got one more question. We always like to do better than Australia, don't we? But are we in net zero? So this question here, do you think the New Zealand investment sector is doing better than Australia on net zero implementation? Again, we can tell Rod that his speech is having an influence on the crowd. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear there that the answer is no, we're not. And what the survey shows is that we're actually lagging behind Australia in pretty much every measure of progress. So with that, I would like to welcome David Lewis onto the stage to take us through those survey results. David, as Barry said, has had a lead role in this survey, constructing it and writing the report as well. David is a student studying sustainability and has recently founded a social enterprise called Novus Consulting that helps large investors implement sustainable investment approaches. Before this, he spent 20 years in finance here and overseas, most recently as a portfolio manager at Milford. So over to you, David.
Tēnā koe, Amy, kia ora koutou. Yeah, it's a couple of tough speakers to follow there on video, but I'll do my best and hopefully the data will be engaging enough to, that you will all appreciate it. First thing to say is thank you all for coming along tonight and for listening online, and a special thanks to everyone who responded to the survey and who sort of bore with our many annoying email reminders for those responses, and a special thanks to everyone who helped a couple of months back with our sort of scoping and outreach around the questions and the survey. Those who provided case studies, those who helped with proofreads, a lot of people contributed to getting this done. So, moving on to key messages. These are the things I'm going to cover tonight, key messages from the survey. Firstly, the optimism of a year ago from last year's survey has been met with a very slow industry-wide response over the subsequent year, despite some positive steps in some quarters. We'll see that the New Zealand investment industry is well behind Australia, gaps evident on almost every measure that we surveyed. Now, size is an important factor with how organisations are responding to climate challenges, but we're finding that our larger firms are also lagging Australia. And we'll have a quick look at some key differences across the subsectors that we surveyed. So we looked at fund managers, asset owners and wealth managers, advisors. Looking in at the background and methodology to the survey, so we had 50 responses that came in. These covered 331 billion in assets, sort of 70 to 80% of investable assets in New Zealand, depending how you measure it. We had a survey that had a short and long version, so there was a core of 10 multi-choice questions across both of those, but we wanted something that was accessible to smaller investors that might be earlier in their climate planning and analytics, as well as those investors that are further down the journey. We had 29 responses to the short survey, 21 to the long survey. Around half the responses came from fund managers. Smaller sample for wealth managers, we had 6 of those, and then 16 responses from asset owners. One of the important things was that we aligned the questions directly with a survey that IGCC was doing of Australian investors at the same time. This covered around 60% of the investable assets in Australia, so we think that both the surveys, generally sort of 60, 70, 80% coverage provide a good reflection of the broad state of industry practice in both countries. And it was really important to make sure those questions were aligned so that we could compare a New Zealand response with an Australian response. The goals with the survey, we wanted to assess the state of play here in New Zealand and assess the progress that has been made over the past year. We wanted to check that progress relative to Australia and also relative to some of the global metrics that we'll be getting out of the UN Race to Zero report over coming months, and some of those already that my colleague Harry will highlight. And we wanted to use the survey itself to highlight best practice. So as you're reading through the questions and thinking about the answers, we were using the survey itself to try and highlight some of the things that people should be doing, and then also through the reports themselves to highlight best practice. So, then and now, looking back to last year's survey, what were some of the ambitions that we saw in that survey? So we had 89% of respondents last year expressing an intention to pursue or explore a net zero pledge. So pretty much everyone who responded said they were kind of keen to think about it or do something. We had 93% of respondents saying they had an ambition to create an emission reductions plan. So again, almost everyone were quite keen to proceed down that route. So what progress have we seen? I'll give you a couple of key metrics. There's many, many more within the report. But we now have 26% of respondents this year with a net zero target, so that's little changed over the year. We now have 58% of respondents that have measured emissions on their portfolio. That's up from 50% last year, so incremental change there. There are some organisations that have come a long way, and a couple of these we highlight with case studies, AMP, NZ Super, and four others there in the case studies in the main report that will be coming out in a couple of weeks. And there has been some gradual progress across the sector. It's just that the overall picture is that we were really optimistic a year ago, and that has not been carried through with substantial progress over 2022. As Barry highlighted, we've had 3 new net zero pledges to an internationally aligned initiative over the course of last year, and that's a pledge that provides obviously support and accountability across a net zero target. And then we've got 4 organisations that have set a target that's not aligned with the pledge. And you can look at the report for more detail around those specific concepts if you need it. I do want to highlight here that those international pledges we think are good for the private sector especially, but they are not for everyone. And we just want to call out that, pleased to see that 13 community trusts in New Zealand have now signed up to the funders' commitment on climate action. Now that includes a commitment to decarbonise investments and operations, but is not subject to specific targets. We think that makes good sense for smaller investors, smaller asset owners in New Zealand, especially in the charitable sector, without the resources of the larger players. So some comparisons to Australia, there's many in the report. I've just got a few metrics to highlight here. We found that we were lagging Australia on almost every measure. There were a couple of measures we were sort of in line, but there were significant gaps that would be way more than anything you could try and explain with survey methodology or sample selection, etc. Significant gaps in net zero targets and scenario analysis, and engagement and governance. A few to highlight. I'll read these out because they're a little bit small on the chart here. The first one relates to reporting. It's looking at the share of respondents who have already done TCFD aligned reporting or expecting to do it within the next 12 months. So that captures what's coming ahead with the climate-related disclosures regime in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, 12 months from now, 61% of respondents saying they will have publicly reported TCFD-aligned measures. In Australia, it's 79%, so we're the world's first with TCFD reporting, but a year from now, we're expecting more Australian investors to have done it. Second thing is looking at advanced analytics. One metric here is the share of respondents who have conducted a whole-of-portfolio climate scenario analysis, so testing your portfolio in terms of how it responds to different temperature scenarios in the future. 12% of respondents in New Zealand have done that. In Australia, it was 43% in IGCC's survey. One measure on engagement, the share of respondents to the survey that have both a formal climate engagement strategy and targets, so both of those, a strategy plus supported by targets. No respondents in New Zealand have that yet, but over a third have that in Australia. And one measure on governance, there's several here I could have highlighted, but by showing here the share of respondents that have no specific governance arrangements incorporated with their board structure regarding climate. 30% of respondents in New Zealand haven't taken any specific steps there yet. In Australia, that was down at 12%. So, we've got smaller investors in New Zealand, and size is a factor, and that comes through with this chart, which I'll just quickly talk through. We're breaking the sample down to the larger investors in the middle there who have over 5 billion in assets under management, AUM, and we can see for that group of larger New Zealand investors, 73% of those have measured emissions on the portfolio, 47% have a net zero target. For our smallest investors in the sample, so there's under 1 billion in assets under management, a bit over 40% have measured emissions and 11% have targets. Sorry, next slide, yep. So just to delve a bit deeper into this issue of size, we had a look at, what if we take that group of the largest New Zealand investors, so those with over 5 billion in assets, and the median size of that group is 11 billion New Zealand dollars. And for that group, 47% of those have a net zero target, either across the whole portfolio or part of it. If we take the Australian survey, it's actually similar size for the organisations in the Australian survey. So you've got around a $14 billion median, and in Australia, 70% have a target of some sort. So even if we sort of look a bit more like for like on size, we're seeing a decent gap in New Zealand industry practice relative to Australia. And I think the other thing that's important to note on size, looking in New Zealand here, and especially overseas, there are a number of smaller investors that are doing a great job. Highlight Bay Trust, for example, in the New Zealand survey. If you go to the Net Zero Asset Managers website, they've got a list there of all 261 signatories. Look through that for the number of investors you'll find. There are a couple of $100 million in size, less than $1 billion in size. Start at the A's, there's heaps of them. A lot of smaller investors are doing a good job. Next slide, please. A couple of quick observations by subsector. Firstly, wealth managers. We surveyed over $65 billion in the wealth management sector. They are lagging. We find other subsectors of the market here in New Zealand, especially regarding net zero targets, so no targets yet amongst our respondents to that survey. I would just quickly mention that we would love to get more responses in this survey next year. So if you're listening to this and your organisation is progressing well and we didn't reach out to you, we apologise and would love for you to get in touch so we can include you next year. There are, just back to wealth managers, there are some that are making good progress in terms of governance arrangements, similar to what we're finding in fund managers and asset owners and client reporting. So, there are some steps being taken in that sector. And second point to make just on the progress on asset managers in terms of how they are looking to incorporate factors like, emissions or net zero or decarbonisation in the mandates that they have with the fund managers who manage assets on their behalf. We're seeing that happening only to a very limited extent. So only around a third of those asset owners are actually telling their fund managers that we want you to explicitly look at these factors. And then if we take out the Crown financial institutions like NZ Super, ACC, that proportion is even less. So a lot of asset owners we're finding are not explicitly asking their managers to consider climate factors. So, conclusion from me, lots of detail in the report, and we've got an upcoming, what we refer to as the full report coming out in a few weeks, which is even more detail. So that'll take you through the whole suite of questions that we asked and what the responses are like. And we really want that to be a great resource for investors. It's full of a lot of references to international initiatives, international best practice, international practice guides. So we want that to be somewhere where people can look and find out about, how do we think about climate scenario analysis, how do we think about climate solutions, etc. If you read the whole thing, please get in touch. I'd be interested to know how many people do that. There is quite a bit there. And the key messages from the survey. So, there's been some progress over the year from the New Zealand investment industry. There are some good examples of individual organisations, and congratulations to those. But there are large gaps in overall industry practice compared to Australia. So collectively, we think our industry has huge work to do, and the bar is raising. Global practice is moving forward quickly. So last thing to say is just thanks again to all those who contributed, and many thanks to our team, Barry, Olive, Harry over in Australia, Andrew who's helping with it now. We really appreciate all the effort from everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, David. So now we're going to hear from Harry. Harry Smith is the Investor Practice Program Manager at IGCC, the investor group on climate change, managing the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative and Paris-aligned asset owners initiatives, both in Australia and New Zealand. Harry runs IGCC's Paris-aligned Investment Working Group and the Investor Practice Masterclass series. Prior to starting at IGCC, Harry worked in sustainable finance and climate risk at Minter Ellison. Harry's here to bring us a bit of international context with a bit of Aussie flavour as well. Just got to get the Zoom set up. Just going to get the Zoom set up.
Can you hear me there, Olive?
Yep. All good. Can I hear you, Harry?
Oh, great. Sounds like you can hear me. Sorry, I can't see anything that end. But very glad to be here. Kia ora, everyone. Glad to have the opportunity to present and I guess create a bit more competitive tension between New Zealand and Australia. But firstly, just wanted to start by saying, how great it's been to work with Mindful Money and the Centre on this survey and report. So a big thanks again and to all the investors for your involvement. IGCC is a collaboration of Australian and New Zealand institutional investors focused on the impact of climate change on portfolios. So we have about 100 members, including 7 New Zealand investor members, and are working with other New Zealand investors through the Net Zero Asset Managers and Paris-aligned Asset Owners initiatives, which we manage in Australia and New Zealand. And both of those initiatives are formal partners of GFANZ and Race to Zero. And on the slide there, you can just see the 3 pillars which investors can use, I guess, to create emission reductions in their portfolio, which also fit neatly into the structure of IGCC's operations. So there's portfolio alignment and, that's really around net zero implementation, company engagement, so driving down emissions in companies through your corporate stewardship and voting, and IGCC manages Climate 100 plus in Australia, and then policy advocacy. So advocating for 1.5 aligned policies in Australia and New Zealand, and that's done through our policy team. And also on the screen there are just some of the key things that we work with our members to help them achieve, and we built those into the survey questions as well. Perfect. So just on the survey structure, which, as David said, is the same as the Australian survey we ran at the same time, this was really aimed to capture the key pillars of investor climate action from leading frameworks. So there's the Net Zero Investment Framework, which was developed last year with input from over 120 global investors. So that is really rooted deeply in investor experience. And then the Investor Climate Action Plans Ladder, which is a consolidation of key sort of actions for investors. So definitely take a look at both of those if you haven't yet. And the survey structure also incorporates many of the asks of the net zero initiatives for asset owners and managers. So that's around, requiring strong interim targets, implementing an engagement and stewardship strategy with a voting and escalation policy, engaging in policy advocacy, and then all the reporting. So setting your targets, producing a climate action plan, and then reporting back on progress annually. So in short, this slide is really just to say that the structure of the survey does align with what investors globally are focusing on. So the big focus this year globally has been on setting robust targets. And this is because it's obviously seen as an important way to kickstart action and build accountability in the shorter term. So in the survey, we asked questions in line with the Net Zero Investment Framework, which is the leading methodology that investors are using globally, and also in New Zealand to set targets, as indicated in the survey, followed by the Science-Based Targets for Financial Institutions, and then the UN Target Setting Protocol. So by setting each of the 4 short-term targets that you can see on the screen there, so the portfolio decarbonisation, climate solutions target, portfolio coverage target, and engagement threshold targets, which I'll run through in a sec, this is really seen as the most effective way to drive real emission reductions in the economy, while also enabling a really practical and rigorous approach to your sort of climate strategy that provides accountability and planning. So the key things to note on this slide, firstly, in terms of 2050 targets, as David said, that's obviously low compared to Australia. In Australia, we're really seeing asset owners leading the charge, with 68% of asset owners having now set net zero targets. In terms of asset owner mandates, in Australia, of the 25 asset owners who responded to the survey, 60% indicated that they include requirements relating to decarbonisation in at least some of their mandates with managers. Whereas in New Zealand, asset owners indicated that generally they're not including this in mandates. So this can certainly be a focus for asset owners in New Zealand going forward, particularly where they've adopted their own net zero targets. The other point to note on 2050 targets is that it is recognised that asset managers act as fiduciaries in managing assets for their clients. And so where asset owner clients have not made their own net zero commitments and so don't necessarily want their mandates to be managed in line with net zero, managers can, continue to work in partnership with these asset owners to work on their decarbonisation goals, but they can also set interim targets for the proportion of assets to be managed in line with net zero, which may exclude, those conflicting mandates of asset owners in the shorter term as a way to sort of get started. So then there's the interim portfolio decarbonisation target on the screen there. So that, for example, is setting a 50% emission reduction by 2030. So again, that's low in New Zealand, as you can see on the screen. The point of this target is really that 2050 is a long way away. And so interim targets are certainly needed for real accountability in the shorter term. And we do recognise the challenge of setting these short-term portfolio targets. But I guess the inherent uncertainties in the transition to net zero should not of itself deter investors from setting these targets. So this may mean building assumptions into the target setting process, because we do need investors to proceed with determination and ambition on this journey and be part of the solutions, and setting short-term targets needs to be a part of that. On the climate solutions targets that you can see on the screen as well, only 8% of New Zealand respondents have these, compared to 21% in Australia. And then globally, under the Paris-aligned Asset Owner Initiative, 55% of signatories have now set this target. So in Australia, we're starting to see good progress on the ambition of this target, ranging from 1 to 20% of AUM committed to being invested in climate solutions by 2030, or we're seeing sort of more qualitative statements of intent. And again, the point of this target is that investors recognise that some investments in transition opportunities are more carbon intensive. And so that's why investors are finding it useful to set this target for allocation to climate solutions alongside their decarbonisation targets, as part of effectively communicating to stakeholders the varying actions that they're taking to drive emission reductions in the real economy. Then, well, I just thought it would be useful to pull out, and we'll put some of this information in the longer report. But through the net zero initiatives, we are seeing global investors move forward with measuring their exposure to climate solutions and then setting targets despite the lack of standardization. And so really not letting a perfect be the enemy of the good. And so the methodologies we're seeing to define climate solutions include, I guess, more inherently green things, so classifications in line with the SDGs, so SDGs 7 and 13, renewable energy and energy efficiency. For listed equity and corporate fixed income, in the shorter term, investors are starting by using green investment ratios and a priority net zero investment ratio to measure their current exposure to climate solutions, or they're using service providers to measure sort of their exposure to green revenues. Some asset owners noted that they're using the asset owner platform, Sustainable Development Investments platform, to measure exposure to climate solutions. And then others are using third-party verifications and labels and climate-specific funds. So it's a bit of a mixture, but thought it would be useful to I guess, show what globally investors are starting to do to move forward with this despite the lack of standardization. And we're also seeing in Australia, asset owners starting to ask managers to explain how they're defining climate solutions. The next target there, which you'll see wasn't asked in 2022, is the portfolio coverage target. So globally, this is a really noticeable focus area compared to last year, with institutional investors working to set this interim portfolio coverage target, or an asset alignment target, which is really a target for the percentage of assets to be considered aligned with net zero. So you'd measure the baseline and then set targets to increase that percentage. So this portfolio coverage target is increasingly seen by investors as the key driver for driving net zero and securing emission reductions in the real economy. And that's really because the target captures the extent to which the underlying assets are delivering against both current and forward-looking alignment indicators. So New Zealand investors weren't asked this, but we did ask, I guess, investors to provide the baseline of their portfolio that they currently consider to be invested in climate solutions. Invested in Paris aligned, basically, using frameworks like the Net Zero Investment Framework. And in short, the overwhelming majority of New Zealand investors have not yet assessed this baseline. Whereas globally, under the Paris-aligned Asset Owners Initiative, we've seen 45% of asset owners have now set a portfolio coverage target to increase the proportion of assets classified as aligned or aligning to a net zero pathway using, and you can see on the top of the screen there's the Net Zero Investment Framework. So you can use that if you wish to use that methodology to conduct the assessment. The final one there is just on the engagement threshold targets. These are targets for the proportion of financed emissions subject to climate engagement. So New Zealand investors are still in the early stage of setting these targets to help drive up meaningful climate engagement across their portfolios, with only 6 respondents in the longer survey indicating such targets are in place. And in Australia and globally, we're seeing a bit more progress, with around 40% have now established a quantitative or qualitative target. I won't go through this slide, but this is just to show that this is real life examples of how investors are taking those 4 shorter term targets and really using them to drive their net zero implementation and progress. So we can send these slides out after the session. So as David mentioned, there were no respondents in New Zealand who indicated they have both a formal engagement strategy and also engagement targets in place, compared to Australia, where 36% did. There is, of course, some good pockets of engagement going on in New Zealand, and great to see the new stewardship code. But I guess, not enough engagement given the importance that this plays in an investor's fiduciary duty to protect and enhance long-term value. So we've put it on the screen there, but would suggest investors use the stewardship toolkit, which provides a framework to help investors prioritize high impact corporate engagement and then hold laggard companies to account through those 6 key steps. And this framework was developed together with a number of leading institutional investors. So again, it's really rooted in investor practical experience. On collaborative engagement, which I'm sure Barry will talk about, we've heard very loudly from the New Zealand market that there's a need for more collaborative engagement. And so we're keen to bring investors together in the market and take some of the learnings from Climate Action 100+, particularly because we know, the power of collaborative engagement and how transformational and effective that is where there's that consistency of ask from investors. But on engagement generally, we know that in Australia, it's seen that around half of asset owners are asking their asset managers to report on engagement actions, whereas in New Zealand, it seems that a very small proportion of asset owners are asking their asset managers to report on their stewardship activities. So this should really be a continued focus area to make sure there's that structured alignment between owners and managers, which is obviously really crucial to reach net zero targets. And the other part of engagement, not on the screen there, is just around policy advocacy, which is another area of engagement, which we did ask a question in the longer survey. And this should, again, remain a focus, given the huge importance that it plays in unlocking capital flows where, we have policies aligned with 1.5. So investors can do great work here, and some are starting to in New Zealand, which is really pleasing to see. And then this is just the last slide, some final few comparisons to build that competitive tension on climate policies, as David touched on. Well, it's 58%, so it's getting there, but in Australia, it's 77%. This is seen as more of an easy win, so hopefully next year this can be up around 100%. TCFD reporting is a bit low, but obviously lots due to report under the CDR, which is promising. As a generalisation, as David said, New Zealand lacks Australia in carbon measurement and metrics, and also risk assessment, particularly to physical risk, which is an issue in Australia as well. And on fossil fuel exclusions and policies, I guess they're both at a similar status across both regions. Both now have a similar amount, having exclusions with revenue thresholds across their portfolios. And internationally, there are some really good examples of, I guess, balancing engagement and divestment by European investors. So do take a look at the Paris-aligned asset owner progress report, where one European investor has set 2-year expectations for fossil fuel companies, and then they'll divest unless those companies have convincing and verifiable transition strategies. So the main point of this slide, though, is really to encourage all investors to develop climate action plans. And you can do this whether or not you have net zero targets. So only 14% of New Zealand investors do have a climate action plan, which is quite low compared to Australia, who are around 36% have a climate action plan. And globally, all investors that are part of the net zero initiatives commit to implement one. We know that developing a climate plan really helps to build consensus on the actions that need to be taken over the shorter term, and it builds that board oversight and accountability, which the plan needs, because these plans really do need to be central to the organisation's strategic planning, given the materiality of climate. So it's not just a sort of responsible investment plan that sits off to the side. And so to develop a plan, investors can use the ICAPS ladder, which is just on the screen there, which really sets out a summary of actions for investors from beginner to those more advanced. And it's across the 5 key areas for investors. And we'd encourage all investors to get to race to tier 1 as soon as possible. And I won't go through the tables on the right of the screen. They're basically just to show how Australian investors are building simple climate plans. So I'll finish there, and thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Panelists up on stage, please. And I think we might just move this off.
Should we move it off?
Yeah, we can move it off, actually. might just grab myself a chair. Yep. Great, so the way I'm going to run the panel this evening, and sorry everyone I knew this would happen, everyone would sit on this side of the room and then we'd have nothing over here. For quick exits, I hope not. So the way I'm going to run the panel today is I'm going to introduce everyone quite briefly and then ask them to give a really short update on the progress that their organisation that they're representing has been on in either the net zero commitments or thinking about net zero commitments. So to start with, I'll start with Katie. So Katie Beath has been in responsible investing for over 20 years, and she's sorry, that's on the website. So she's currently head of ESG at Forsyth Barr. Prior to Forsyth Barr, Katie was at the New Zealand Super Fund as a senior investment strategist for RI. Katie is also on multiple boards, including the XRB Stakeholder Advisory Panel and the New Zealand National Advisory Board for Impact Investing. So Katie, can you start by telling us about the journey that Forsyth Barr has been on, and in particular, I'm really interested in sort of the wealth management space and any challenges for wealth managers as well.
Good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here and part of this super important conversation, which I think is taking place at a very poignant moment in time. So I joined Forsyth Barr just over a year ago, and in my role as head of ESG, and thanks to Barry for inviting me here today to be part of this panel and to provide some views on the perspective of wealth managers. So let's face it, those results weren't looking so good for the wealth managers. And I guess I just want to bring a couple of perspectives on that. And firstly, I think to say that while the wealth managers in New Zealand don't have targets in place, it doesn't mean that they're not doing anything. And a key focus for me over my last year and my time at Forsyth Barr so far has been really about educating advisors and clients on what net zero actually means from an investment perspective, and building up that capability and resources to help those clients who want to move in this direction to do so. And it's really not an easy process to work through. As the report states, we have quite a decentralised approach where advisors are entrusted with their own relationships with individual clients. And it's something that we hold really sacred, and the relationships that advisors build with their individual clients are the backbone of our business. Another factor to consider is that some clients are autonomous and instruct us on portfolio decisions, whereas others give us discretion to invest on their behalf in a way that meets their investment and ethical needs. And an important point to make here is that every client's values are different, and an advisor's job is to cater for that specificity. So where does all of that leave us in terms of acting on climate change? It means that, yes, it is hard, but not impossible, to make firm-wide pledges. But that does not mean that significant action is not underway. And for us, I think really the starting point is about understanding each client's individual values and then ensuring that they're reflected in portfolios. And I've got just a couple of points to pull out. Firstly, this is about education for both advisors and clients on what net zero actually is and what a net zero portfolio looks like, the decisions that need to be made along the way, and the trade-offs that need to be considered. It's about understanding the values of clients, where they sit on the risk-return impact spectrum, and where they sit on the engage, divest, transition spectrum. Having the ability to run carbon analytics over portfolios to assess where companies are at now so we can measure how things are changing is a really important part. And once we've got all that crystal clear, like easy, right? Once all that's crystal clear, we can start to develop, transition plans and climate plans and get things going. So I think, I guess the point to make is that while targets and pledges are important, but their absence doesn't mean that there's a lack of action. And maybe we can discuss a bit more on the pros and cons later. And just super quickly before we move on, the really last point I want to make, that there's another hat here as well, and that it's not within the wealth managers. Advisors are one side of things, and then the other hat that I wear is also in part of the research team. And we've got a big piece of research coming out. We've got a big role to play here as well. And we've got a big piece coming out shortly that will be looking at net zero commitments across New Zealand companies and how they're preparing for the upcoming climate disclosures. And it's a form of engagement. It's already driving movement. The companies are responding, want to do what they can to get better scores. And I think, it's positive in that they are understanding now they are starting to understand what investors believe are important. And I really look forward to being able to talk more about that in the future.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Katie. No, it's not. It's all right. I've got a pretty loud voice if I need to have one. Fantastic. Thanks, Katie. And we'll definitely pick up on a few of those points later as well. So I'd now love to introduce Greg Munford to you. Just get my notes so I can read out his CV properly. So with over 15 years of experience in multiple sectors, including water, coastal, marine, energy, transportation, agri, and natural resources, Greg now finds himself at New Zealand Super as a senior responsible investing strategist. So I'll pass over now to Greg, and I think you've got some slides as well, don't you? Yeah, just to tell us about the journey that you've been on and New Zealand Super as well. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, kia ora, Amy. Yeah, I thought it'd be useful just to, there's a lot of momentum here, and I thought it'd just be useful just to check back and just see where an institution like the Super Fund, where we've come from. So I think it's important to see that momentum, and that we're also sort of feeding into the wider sort of sectoral changes. So as you can see there, there's it's pretty extensive. Series of milestones, really, in terms of our journey, both in terms of recognizing climate change as a risk and opportunity, and more recently in terms of the net zero transition. I'll keep it quite light today, but I think there is a climate change report, a detailed climate change report on the website for any net zero nerds that want to sort of get into the details. So it's wonderful to have Katie up here as one of the sort of drivers of a lot of this work, as well as Lucas, Anne-Marie, and Matt Winneray. I think what we've seen is what we've embarked on in the last year or so, most recently, is a shift from that responsible investment, ESG risk footing, towards a more ambitious sustainable finance approach. And that really means looking to embed and consider sustainability outcomes in all of our investments, as well as looking to help shape the sustainable finance sector. So we've hatched a fairly ambitious roadmap to guide us along those steps. We've updated our purpose at the sort of central organisation, and we've recognised that although there's a lot of work to do, there's also a lot of momentum out there. So. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to start with our climate change investment strategy, which has been a key driver of the work to date, and sort of really helped to support the Super Fund in terms of reducing, analysing, engaging, and searching for climate change solutions. The most recent milestone that we've met in 2021 was our commitment, joining the Net Zero Asset Owners commitment. And that really came down to a belief that we can deliver better environmental and social outcomes without compromising returns, and so we should. And I think that's something that which really comes back to what our stakeholders expect. I think we also recognize that when the economy, the global economy, or the wider economy does well, we do well as a diversified investor. And in the big picture, the benefits of a proactive approach to climate risk outweigh the costs. And we also recognized over the last few years that markets weren't really accounting for climate risk. We saw that it was prudent to reduce our exposure to uncompensated risk and to proactively invest in opportunities. And so the 4 interlinking pillars of the climate change investment strategy essentially help to address these risks and opportunities, whilst also helping us progress our net zero journey. Next slide, please. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on kind of where we're at now and the next steps. So in June, the board agreed that we should shift our global passive listed equities portfolio to a new Paris-aligned index. And that corresponds to about 25 billion New Zealand dollars of the overall investment portfolio. Our next step is to look at improving our active assets, and I think that's, at the moment, that's looking at the multi-factor equity portfolio and considering whether we can find an approach which doesn't unduly impact financial returns. We're also keeping an eye on developments in the fixed income space and looking at our private asset portfolio. So we're working our leadership, collaboration, and engagement, as Harris and David have pointed out, is a key pillar of that net zero investment, net zero asset owners commitment. And so we're working with IGCC, RIA, Climate Action 100 and others to help advance that agenda. And then just really monitoring, reporting and adapting. So, looking at the implications and outcomes of the changes we've made to date and sort of looking to finesse those and increase our ambitions. So lots of learning opportunities. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Now, I know I did promise that you could ask questions on the Slido, but we are running a bit behind time. So what I might suggest is that if you do have a burning question, you can put it in the Q&A on Slido. It's next to the polls. We might not get to it tonight. However, everyone here will be staying around afterwards, and you're welcome to ask in person. And those online, I'm sure the speakers wouldn't mind addressing some of them with you later. So, Kate, you're up next. So Kate is Pathfinder's resident ESG analyst with an academic background in environmental science. Kate's passionate about climate and sustainability, and she's been at Pathfinder for over 4 years. So, Kate, I'll hand over to you to tell us a little bit about what's been going on at Pathfinder.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So Pathfinder has been around for just over 10 years now, probably. And since its inception, it's always been very ESG focused, sustainability focused. But with the launch of the KiwiSaver in 2019, that kind of became a real opportunity for us to push a lot further with our climate goals. Already, we'd excluded fossil fuels, done kind of the basic stuff, but really getting on that journey and figuring out what's our actual game plan, how we're going to get there. So using the Science-Based Target Initiative resources, Task Force for Climate Disclosures, target setting, joining the UNFCCC Race to Zero campaign, and especially for us at the moment, continuing to work on improving our monitoring and disclosing Scope 3 emissions. I think Scope 2, most institutions here probably also have very low Scope 2 emissions, and I think that can be a bit of an easy kind of call to make that, oh, this is fine, but the Scope 3 is really where we've actually got a lot of the problems coming from. And we have found that as regulations are starting to come in, both in New Zealand and just around the world, there is some more comparable data that we can actually use, different frameworks that we can compare ourselves to others and see what it actually means, what we're doing. And I would say the 3 key net zero targets that we've been setting is around, which have already been touched on, but around portfolio decarbonisation, investing in climate solutions, and getting that coverage of these material sectors, these really high emitting sectors, or the asset alignment. But the key barriers for us really is that, one, getting full buy-in and true understanding from everyone at the business, so all the way from the board to the people that maybe you don't see that often, and getting that real understanding and pushing that through the entire business so we're actually doing the right thing. And engagement, which has also been touched on a little bit, we've had some struggles with that too, I think. Maybe thinking of ourselves as like a small fish in like a small pond makes it kind of difficult, but I think, collaborating is probably the way to go with that. But yeah, we're excited to keep this thing going.
Thanks, Kate. And finally, Barry, and I don't need to introduce you because we all know you by now. But what I'm really interested for you to tell us about, Barry, is the journey that Mindful Money's been on in supporting the net zero community. So if you can tell us a bit about that.
Cool. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. So Mindful Money was started about 3 years ago, and it came from, in a way, some follow-up work to my experience in the UK in the early 1990s and the formation of the first ethical investment network over there. And it always seemed to me that there would be a time when there would be a tipping point where people would start to recognize that investing in line with their values would actually be something that people naturally wanted to do, but that they needed the information to do it. And so Mindful Money was set up as a charity because we wanted to make sure that we were acting in terms of trying to push the agenda along rather than in having commercial goals. And we're founded on, in a way, empowering investors to take action. So transparency was important, and the question that a lot of investors have is, where does my money go? And so Mindful Money was set up with transparency in portfolio holdings, and we relate portfolio holdings on a look-through basis to the issues that the New Zealand public are concerned about. And so that starting point was really about giving investors the power to choose and the information to choose. One of the things that we found then is a lot of investors interpreted that then as being an exclusionary framework, that if they saw stuff in their portfolio that they didn't like, then it should naturally be excluded. So one of the things we're doing is we're trying to work a little bit more to build more public education around the power of engagement, the power of stewardship, where companies are willing to change. And I think where, one of the questions that came in from Sebastian is, how do you manage that tension between divestment and engagement? And I think for us, it's around how willing the companies are to actually move on to a net zero pathway. And we're doing some research at the moment on, for example, which fossil fuel companies are actually following a 1.5 degree pathway. And it's disturbing to find that, in fact, the majority of fossil fuel companies are still expanding their production, investing in an expansion against the recommendation of the IEA and the UN Secretary General and the IPCC. So we're seeing a disconnect in many of the areas between often what companies say that they are doing and what they're actually doing. And I think engagement has to be quite nuanced to make sure that you're engaging with companies that really are going to take those steps and that they're sufficient in an era of climate change to really be on a transition pathway as opposed to playing catch up. So the third area, so you know, we really kind of look to a very simplistic model of you know, the action on climate change as being you can get out of your high emitting investments, you can engage to improve performance, or you can invest in climate solutions. It may be a little simplistic, but actually I think those are the three major levers that investors have to take action. And so we're as Mindful Money, pushing much more through into that impact, positive impact investment and the solutions. And we haven't been able to do that until now because there haven't been a lot of funds on offer in New Zealand so that investors could choose to invest in things that create positive impact and climate solutions. And it's really pleasing to see that now actually this movement is taking place. And there are a number of fund managers in the audience who are part of that. And we're very keen to engage with investors about their aspirations for their investment, making a difference in society and to the environment and to climate change, rather than just getting out of things that they don't want to invest in. So that's the kind of journey we're on this. We spend a lot of time engaging and educating the public. We have a new series of our online seminars. You should all watch them, please. On COP27 yesterday, which was great fun, and really interesting variety of reports from Sharm el-Sheikh as to what's happening in the negotiations. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to do a follow-up to this seminar, which is to really try and help the public understand what we're talking about here. You know, what are we talking about with these pathways, with these measures, with these targets? What are those levers for action, and how do they take place in reality with investors deciding not to invest, engaging, or investing in climate solutions? So that's happening on November the 30th. And just to say that this work with the coalition and the work on the survey is for us a natural outgrowth of our journey, and we're committed to trying to do whatever we can to both engage consumers but also engage with the investment sector in pushing that agenda forward and in a way that hopefully is constructive and helpful.
Thanks, Perry. So I'm going to pick up on 2 points that have been raised and pose a couple of quick questions to the panellists. And one of them has been picked up in the Slido as well regarding greenwashing. So greenwashing has probably, I would say, in the last 12 months really ramped up, and at COP it was highlighted around net zero commitments, and we heard from Dr. Carr talking about how many organisations or cities and regions have set net zero targets, but you know, less than 50% of them actually have a plan to meet those targets. So I'd love to ask the question maybe to Kate to just give us a little bit of a overview of greenwashing and what it means for net zero commitments.
Yeah, so greenwashing, I think, honestly, I've never really drilled down on an exact definition, because I think there's so many different vague ways they can do it. But I'm sure most people are familiar with the concept, right? If you've seen, was it Kathmandu that did an ad about plastic in their clothes and they had to take it down? Something like that. They were using recycled plastic, but they weren't really. But so I think there can be a real disconnect between, I think, marketing and the actual product. So I think there's a fine line really between marketing with a green perspective and then straight up greenwashing. I think, obviously, there's plenty of intentional greenwashing out there too, but I do think that it can genuinely be accidental, where companies haven't really actually understand the claims they're trying to make. They're coming from somewhere, but then they've exaggerated it, they've changed the wording, and it's come across like completely differently. And so I think that's a big risk factor for companies as well, even those that are aware of greenwashing and watching out for it. I think it's actually something that's quite easy for companies to just kind of fall into and accidentally do. Because I think it's just sort of one of those things that has always been done that way, so why change? But they're going to have to change. And we've been seeing a lot of actual pushback from these And so advertising authorities actually making businesses take these things down, getting a lot of like public complaints. The HBSC bank one, that was getting a lot of just public complaints just from people walking by and seeing it. So it is heartening that people are beginning to actually be able to recognize it a bit. But obviously the point of it is that it's hard to recognize. But so in terms of net zero, I think a big issue with the greenwashing of net zero is that companies will talk about their scope 1 and 2 emissions and their net zero there, but usually the bulk of their emissions are going to be in scope 3, and those still are their emissions. So to just completely ignore, not even mention that you have all these other emissions, to me that's greenwashing. I think that's misleading. Other ways that they might do it is just sort of being a bit vague, saying, you know, this product, buying this product reduces plastic, but there's no reason why, and there's no evidence for it, and so that kind of thing will get taken back as well. I think there's often greenwashing that kind of I think to avoid the greenwashing when making net zero claims, I think a lot of companies start to do it actually before they've even actually achieved it. They set the goal and then they call themselves net zero, which isn't very accurate, obviously. A lot of companies can make these net zero claims while they're still actually building and investing in fossil fuel supplies. Carbon offsetting is also another way that they can really kind of get away hiding a lot of their stuff. Exploiting land-based carbon sinks in the global south, so basically pushing our emissions off again to the global south and making it their problem. But basically, I think the voluntary initiatives aren't enough, and we need the regulators to just crack down more.
Thanks. Thanks, Kate. And now I wanted to, probably for the last comment of the panel, and I might just ask all the panellists if they want to speak to it, they can, and then we'll sort of look to sort of wrap up, is just to talk about the challenges and the barriers to achieving net zero or putting net zero commitments in place, and why some organisations might not want to do that just yet. So yeah, I kind of set that context, which might help us understand why some of that progress has not developed so far. So Katie or Greg, did you want to sort of start off? But I'll just say that we don't have much time, so please keep it brief. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'll start with complexity. I think it's a good one. It is really hard, and I think this could be quite overwhelming to see some of the pace and scale of what some people are doing. So I think it's important just to recognise that making decisions under deep uncertainty is very difficult, and it doesn't get much more uncertain than the last few years. So I think just recognising that barrier. Resource constraints are very real, both in terms of availability and capability of sort of integrating lots of technical subject matter into an actionable analysis and actionable plan. So I think many organisations aren't built to think, plan, and act in the long term. So I think that's one of the sort of challenges. It's been difficult to overcome. More practically, I think many organisations are still struggling to set firm targets and sort of develop transition plans. There is an enduring ambiguity around definitions and standards, which I think does hamper either the ability or the integrity of and the sort of conviction in transition plans. So I think that's adding to that complexity. But I think the main message is that nobody's nailing it. Work with what's available. It's rapidly getting better. The transition will be an incremental, sort of multi-stop process, and it's better to start moving together deliberately rather than get left behind in the fog. Yeah.
I could probably wrap up there, I reckon.
Oh, really?
Personally, I think it's right to be conservative on making big public commitments right now when there is this uncertainty, there's scrutiny, there's scepticism, there's mistrust. And I do think that organisations need to take their time to work through and come up with a genuine commitment that's got all the elements of best practice so that they aren't accused of greenwashing. It's an evolving space, as we know. It's changing, and you need time to sort of get a broad level of comfort, just not from the board, or from the board to the executives, to advisors, to clients, bringing your employees along the way, and create the ability to measure progress over time. And I know you've got to weigh all of that with the urgency to act and what we're facing. So I think the message is that there's plenty to get on with, and that you can do while you work through the sort of tough, difficult cultural change piece that's really crucial to meaningful progress, so that your eventual outcome is the right outcome for what we're all trying to achieve here. In terms of the actual net zero commitments, there's a lot of ambiguity in them on what they cover in terms of scope, and are they to a 1.5 degree world or a 2? Do they have interim targets? Or all of those sorts of things. And I think some consistency and that will really help. And I think that the report that Dr. Carr was involved in on greenwashing comes a long way to helping us all think about consistency and a genuine net zero commitment.
What was the question?
If you want to, but
what was the question?
We are running out of time.
I think I kind of mentioned my barriers, really.
That's good. Thanks so much, Kate. Great. So we are fast running out of time. So thank you for sending through questions on the Slido. What we might do is collate those questions and then we'll look to address some of them later. I think we'll have probably some comms. I'm sure you all follow Mindful Money or various people on the panel or speakers on LinkedIn, so I'm sure we can sort of talk to some of these really good points. But thank you for sending them through and for upvoting as well. So thanks to the panellists for joining tonight. Thank you for your insights from a range of perspectives and organisations. I think it's been really good to sort of unpack that. Obviously, we're always pressed for time in these things, and we're always ambitious, not only in our commitments, but in what we can fit into a seminar. So thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over to Barry, who's going to just say some wrap-up comments, and then I'm going to formally close us out with a karakia before we can tap into some drinks.
Thank you, Amy. So just a few words about so what's next. The survey, as we said, did identify some barriers. One of those is around training and capability development, skills building around the whole agenda, not only net zero, but reducing emissions in portfolios. And I commend to the work that the community of practice on net zero is doing, chaired by Amy and driven by Amy. If those of you who are interested in finding out more, contributing, sharing, collaborating around that, I think it's a really useful forum just to engage and take this forward. So that's one of the things that's happening. There was a strong call for collaboration, and particularly collaboration around engagement. So obviously IGCC is part of that answer, through, for example, the Climate Action 100+, but also so is the Stewardship Code and the follow-up to the Stewardship Code. So the Secretariats RIA and Toitu Tahua. So that's a natural form for collaboration. There are other aspects of collaboration that certainly members of the coalition are going to want to follow up as well. So I think there are some collaborative actions around engagement. There's also, I think, need for collaboration around climate solutions and impact. It's an issue really of kind of great importance to Mindful Money, so we're going to be doing some work around impact and climate solutions, again working with Toitu Tahua and the Impact Investing Network and others. But that piece around sort of making the climate solutions space a little bit more of a strong commitment in New Zealand. It's obviously some opportunities, but I think there's a need for some collaboration and exploring action around that. There will be, of course, some more awareness raising, and one of the things is to, as we've been talking about, engage the public with what this is, because the demand from the public for emissions reductions, for climate information, for net zero is a really important part of building the case, the business case, for funds to go further. And so that's obviously something that we're very keen on, others as well. I think that public education, but also awareness raising within the finance sector. And there's I think a lot of funds that haven't really done much on this journey yet. And as we've heard, some of the players within the wealth management sector, asset owners, and I think so there's work to do to be able to reach out to more actors than those who are already engaged. And finally, this kind of monitoring and feedback process we intend to continue. This is number one in terms of the survey. We'd love to continue, but in order to do so, it relies on the responses of the finance sector to the surveys. And so, as David said, thank you all hugely for responding to the survey and providing this information, and hopefully it'll provide a basis for some acceleration of New Zealand action around reduction of emissions and net zero in future. So I'll pass back to Amy to close us off.
Thanks, Barry. So I don't really have much more to add. Probably all that I would reflect on is that we didn't talk too much about engagement here, but what we've got on Monday with the Coalition Community of Practice is actually a focus session on engagement, and we've got 3 speakers. Katie again, I always call on Katie. We also have a guest from IGCC who focuses on engagement, and we've also got a colleague of mine in consulting at Deloitte who used to work in investor relations for a view from the corporate. So if there's anyone who is interested in joining that on Monday, it would be a really good one to come to hear what the investment community is thinking about regarding engagement. It's convened by me and sort of driven by me, but I'm kind of just the energy trying to get people along. So it's very much what we talk about is from those members of the community. So with that, I think I will just close out with a karakia to close, and we've got some drinks and some light snacks as well, and really encourage you to stay around for a wee bit. I've heard there's a crash on the motorway, so it probably helps if you stay. All right, so I'll just stand up. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, taikie. Thank you all.
See right through you, flying high in Freddy Voodoo, lucid dreaming, magic, wonder. Can you see this spell I'm under? Make you wonder with that rhythm.